What can architecture or building design tell us about Greek beliefs and values? This slideshow addresses this question. We've looked at cultural beliefs and values that are often said to be typical of the Greeks. Keep these in mind today, asking yourself, where do you see these ideas reflected in the Parthenon? We're going to focus on one example of Greek architecture. The Parthenon is said to be the peak of classical Greek architecture. As you watch, you can take notes on your document. You have a copy of this document here. You can take notes on your own copy of this document. Why and when was the Parthenon built? Who built it? Who was Pericles? How was mathematics used in the construction of this building? What optical adjustments did its designers make? And why did they do that? What is the difference between Doric and Ionic? What was inside the Parthenon? How does the Parthenon celebrate the Athenians? And the overall question, what does the Parthenon tell us about Greek beliefs and values? Let's start with a video introduction.
We're looking at the Parthenon. This is a huge marble temple to the goddess Athena.
We're on the top of a rocky outcropping in the city of Athens, very high up, overlooking the city, overlooking the Aegean Sea.
Now, Athens was just one of many Greek city-states, and almost every one had an Acropolis, that is, had a fortified hill within its city, because these were warring states.
But in the 5th century, Athens was the most powerful city-state, and that's the period that the Parthenon dates to.
And this precinct became a sacred one rather than a defensive one. This building has had tremendous influence, not only because it becomes the symbol of the birth of democracy, but also because of its extraordinary architectural refinement. The period when this was built in the 5th century is considered the high classical moment, and for so much of Western history, we have measured our later achievements against this perfection.
It's hard not to recognize so many buildings in the West, and there's certainly an association, especially to buildings in Washington, D.C., and that's not a coincidence.
Because this is the birthplace of democracy. It was a limited democracy, but democracy nevertheless.
Beyond Greece, you can see copies of the Parthenon everywhere in the United States, but perhaps none is so intentional as the one you see here in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a fully intact replica, unlike the original, which has lost many of its decorative elements over time. And it's in a park in Nashville. It also serves as an art museum. To fully appreciate the Parthenon and its originality and beauty, you have to understand what earlier Greek temples were like. The Parthenon is a temple. We don't have many temples for comparison. The earliest Greek temples don't survive because they were made of mud, brick, and wood, and these materials deteriorate over time. But here you can make a side-by-side comparison between an earlier temple and the Parthenon. This early temple is one of several that can be seen at a place called Paestum, a major ancient Greek city on the coast, you see here, of southern Italy. Remember, the Greeks were settled all around the Mediterranean coast centuries before Rome began, as you can see on this map. Here, take a second to just observe, and what differences do you notice? Perhaps you see that the Parthenon's well-spaced columns look more elegant than those of this earlier bulging squat temple. The Parthenon looks more vertical, while the older temple seems heavy and horizontal. The capitals at the top of each column here seem like they're being flattened under the weight of the roof, whereas comparatively, the Parthenon has this sense of lift. Briefly, let me say a little bit about the purpose and use of a Greek temple. Most religious buildings today are intended for groups of people to get together and celebrate their God, to give spiritual comfort to each other. But ancient Greek temples were rarely used in that way. They were meant to serve as homes for the individual god or goddess who protected and sustained the community. It was the needs of the gods here that are the most important, not the humans. The god or goddess for each temple, usually represented by a statue, occupied the central place inside a Greek temple. So back to mainland Greece, the Parthenon was built in the city-state of Athens. What was happening in Athens in the 5th century BCE that gave rise to this architectural masterpiece?
The
Parthenon was the greatest monument and the greatest sanctuary in the greatest city of classical Greece. It was the central repository of the Athenians' lofty conception of themselves and the physical marble embodiment of their values, their beliefs, their myths, their ideologies. It was as much a temple to Athens and the Athenians as it is to their patron goddess, Athena Parthenos.
But just 30 years before it was built, Athens lay in ruins. A victim of Emperor Xerxes, leader of Greece's traditional enemy, Persia. The Athenians rally the rest of the Greek city-states and, with a series of heroic military victories, drive out the Persian invaders. With the foreign threat neutralized and nearly 200 cities across the Aegean paying into a mutual defense fund, Athens grows wealthy. It's now 450 BCE, and a former general emerges as leader, Pericles. He spearheads an ambitious campaign to rebuild Athens and ushers in the golden age of Greece. A unique window of time that establishes Western ideals of beauty, science, art, and a radical new form of government. Demos, meaning people, and kratos, power, people power, or democracy.
So it was under the leadership of Pericles that the Athenians undertook this project of rebuilding the Acropolis after the Persian attack in 480 BCE. The funds for this project came from the account that many Greek city-states were paying into after winning the war against Persia, and they paid that money as a kind of collaborative insurance or tax to guarantee their common defense in case Persia should attack again in the future. But the money was kept in Athens's treasury. So you might notice a contradiction here. Athens is the birthplace of democracy, but it's using money paid by her allies, which is meant for the common defense. Instead, Athens is using that money to build a glorious temple to build herself. So is this democratic, or is it using your power to bully your allies into submission? The reconstruction of the Acropolis was one of the most ambitious building projects ever undertaken. Pericles couldn't order the Athenians to undertake this expensive project. He was an elected government official. So unlike, say, a pyramid built for an Egyptian pharaoh, this is not a forced labor monument to honor a dictator. As a democracy, the decision of what to do after the war had to be put to a vote in Athens, and the Athenians themselves chose to approve this plan to build the largest marble building in the world. The building is a powerful statement of Athens' self-confidence and their pride, and as you'll see, though in some ways it is a temple to honor a goddess, it is in many ways a temple built to celebrate the Athenians themselves and to declare their democratic greatness. The construction of the Parthenon, which you see here, building number 1, lasted from 447 to 438 BCE. I wonder if you can tell how many years is that. Remarkably, the restoration team, which is today working to repair some of the damage that the Parthenon has suffered, they've taken over 30 years and spent well over $100 million, restoring what the ancient Athenians built in just 8 or 9 years. Notice there are other buildings in this Acropolis complex too, but work on all of them stopped in 431 BCE when Athens went to war with Sparta, and it was never resumed. Though we have ruins, it's a miracle that we even have those today. After the long and destructive war between Athens and Sparta, ancient Greece would never return to its earlier greatness of the 5th century BCE, and eventually the city-states of ancient Greece would be conquered, first by Macedonians from the north, then by Romans from the west. And then centuries later, after the fall of Rome, the Parthenon became a Christian church, and Christians removed the statue of Athena that was originally inside. And then when the Muslim Ottoman Empire conquered Greece in the 15th century, it was turned into a mosque. You can see the minaret rising here from the building in this engraving. Finally, in a 17th century battle between some Italians and the Ottoman Empire, a rocket exploded in the center of the building where a bunch of ammunition was stored, and it blew off the roof and destroyed much of the Parthenon's artwork. After that, in the early 1800s, a British diplomat named Lord Elgin tried to save some of the Parthenon's surviving statues by taking them and bringing them with him back to England. Many of these so-called Elgin marbles, marble treasures brought by Lord Elgin, they're stored today in the British Museum, which you see here. This is really controversial because the Greek government wants them back. However, the British Museum resists, and one of their arguments is that they can better protect historical treasures by keeping them in the British Museum. Again, this is just the latest version of a centuries-long argument about ownership of the Parthenon and its treasures. After all, if you were a non-Athenian Greek, you might argue that the buildings are yours. After all, it was built with your ancestors' money. So what do you think? Where do you think the Elgin marbles belong? Now that you know something about the history of the building, let's talk about the architectural construction of the building itself. The Parthenon was the crowning achievement of Pericles' Acropolis reconstruction project, and it was designed by famous architects who attached their name to this. They take credit for this. They want the pride that goes with having built this thing or designed this thing. It's Iktinos and Kallikrates. It was built between 447, 446, and 438 BCE in the middle of the 5th century BCE. This is considered the high point of what's called classical Greece. You might think of beauty as an undefinable concept. You know it when you see it, but it's hard to give a universal definition because it's kind of a matter of personal preference or taste, right? Well, for the Athenians, beauty was not just a matter of personal, individual taste. And it's not just an art, but it's an objective, rational science. They believed that they could uncover the underlying principles of the universe and unlock the secrets about how the world works using mathematics, and that includes beauty. Pythagoras was a Greek mathematician who lived 100 years before the building of the Parthenon. He's known for discovering something called the golden ratio. The Greeks supposedly thought that the golden ratio was special because it repeatedly appeared in nature and it was very pleasing to the eye. So you can see, apparently, ask your math teacher, you can see it in flowers, in seeds, in pine cones, in tree branches, in shells, seashells, galaxies, hurricanes. Pythagoras' golden ratio is this mathematical formula for beauty, a ratio 1 to 1.6. For centuries, it was widely believed that the Parthenon, with its balanced straight lines and beautiful proportions, was built according to this golden ratio. Now, I can't explain the math to you. Maybe you've studied it in math class. But the point here is that Greeks were obsessed with precision in math. You can see it here in the geometrical designs going on behind the scenes or underneath the surface of the Parthenon. They believed there was a fundamental mathematical order to nature and to the universe that they could unlock and understand. Scholars have challenged that idea of the golden ratio in this building, but there are some other mathematical ratios and formulas used here in the building that give it its harmonic proportions that the Greeks loved. For example, there's a very common 4:9 ratio found throughout the building, including the width of the Parthenon, its front versus its length, or the size of its face, the height of the face versus its width. Another way of expressing a 4:9 ratio is through this algebraic formula, 2y plus 1 equals x. So 2 times 4 plus 1 equals 9. So there's your 4:9 ratio. Here's one example. If y is the number of columns across the front, which is 8, what is x? 2 times 8 plus 1 is, yeah, you got it, 17. And there are 17 columns down the length of the Parthenon. Apparently, that same ratio is found throughout many elements of the building. How did Athenians make such precise geometric measurements that they find in the Parthenon? Well, scholars have discovered this ancient Athenian version of a meter stick or a ruler. It's called the Salamis Stone. It may have been a very simple way for the workers of the Parthenon from different areas to calibrate their tools so that all the measurements would be the same. But the really interesting thing about it is that the starting point for Athenian measurement is the human body. Here, the Salamis Stone shows you that the ancient Athenians were using the human body to create what we now regard as ideal proportions. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras, who wrote about a generation before the Parthenon was constructed, said that man is the measure of all things. He meant this metaphorically to emphasize the importance of human beings in the universe. And this tells you something about the Greeks, how they put humans above all else in nature. This is a perspective that's not necessarily shared by other cultures. Other cultures might emphasize more of a balance between humans and nature, or the culture might go the opposite direction and teach that humans are the subjects of nature and should bow down and respect nature. But the point is that the Greeks thought that humans were above and they loved themselves. To sum up the role of mathematics and measures and the human body as the basis for all beauty, let's watch a 2-minute clip.
For centuries, many scholars believed the golden ratio gave the Parthenon its tremendous power and perfect proportions. Most notably, the ratio of height to width on its facades is a golden ratio. Today, the golden ratio's use in the Parthenon has been largely discredited, but Manolis Koris and most scholars believe another ratio does in fact appear in much of the building.
The width is, for instance, 30 meters and 80 centimeters. The length is 69 meters and 51 centimeters, the ratio being 4:9.
The 4:9 ratio is also found between the width of the columns and the distance between their centers and the height of the facade to its width.
The Parthenon, like a statue, exemplifies a certain symmetry, a certain harmony of part to part and of part to the whole. There's no question that the harmony of the building, which is clearly one of its most visible characteristics, is dependent upon a certain mathematical system of proportions.
For the Greeks, there was nothing better than a design based on the coming together of measures, of proportions and harmonies and shapes. It's rather like an orchestrated piece of music in which the harmonies of the various instruments are sort of fused together in a wonderful, glorious, orchestrated symphony.
With something like the Salamis Stone's use of the human body as units of measure, and the idealized human form to define perfect proportions, the Parthenon literally embodies the words of the Greek philosopher Protagoras, who lived in Athens during the construction of the Parthenon. Man is the measure of all things. But proportions and principles do not a perfect Parthenon make.
Wait, so at the end there he said it's not perfect? Well, didn't we just learn that the Athenians were aiming to create something perfect in its beauty using precise mathematical measures based on the human form? Well, keep watching to learn how they purposely set the rules of math aside to build in some imperfections to trick us.
The building, celebrated as a symbol of beauty and perfect proportions, hides an ancient secret. Kathy Paraski and Lena Lambrinou, architects on the restoration team, investigate.
You think that all the blocks are square in this building, but in fact, if you check it with a set square, you can see that we don't have a right angle here.
And when Paraski places her book on one end of the stylobate, the Parthenon's foundation, it can't be seen from the other end.
This is because there is a curve in the middle of the lines and the stylobate, about 6 3/4 centimeters high.
Koris and his team have investigated every angle on the Parthenon. And although the building looks straight, they've discovered there's barely a straight line on it. These curves are no accident. They start with the foundation, or stylobate. Each of the 46 columns has a gently curving profile and leans inward. Even the architraves, marble beams that span the columns, as well as the architectural elements above them, are curved. This means that each of the over 70,000 pieces of the Parthenon is unique and fits in only one place.
So that's amazing that each piece is unique. I'm sure that the Greeks, in their democratic glory, like to think of themselves each as unique individuals with a unique voice. There are lots of irregularities and deviations in the mathematical rule that the Greeks have built in here for maximum visual effect. The stylobate, the base, the floor of the Parthenon curves up in the center. The outer columns are 2 inches thicker than the inner columns. They lean in a little bit towards the center. Here's another view. There's swelling as the columns swell. There's leaning. There's curving. All of this gives the building a sort of sense of being alive and living and breathing, a dynamism to the building. Why are the Greeks breaking their own mathematical rules? The Athenians seem to think that they're smarter than nature. They make improvements or refinements to trick our eyes into seeing something that looks perfect and straight and symmetrical, even though it's not. Watch to find out how the Athenians mastered the brain science of optical illusions.
Why are these builders deliberately constructing their temples with curves and few right angles? Professor Margaret Livingstone, a Harvard neurobiologist, believes the ancient Greeks might have been aware of optical illusions.
The function of the visual system is not to transmit an image to the brain. There's nobody up there to look at an image. It's to transmit information about the world up to the brain.
Our brain translates visual information, like converging lines, to help us assess distance and relative size. But sometimes something's lost in translation. Here, the converging lines are telling us that the line on the right is taller than the line on the left. The result, an optical illusion.
This is another classical illusion. If you have two straight lines, if you add converging lines, these two lines seem to bow in the middle. So if the floor of the Parthenon has converging cues as to depth and perspective, you could have an illusory sag in the floor of the Parthenon.
Perhaps to compensate for the illusory sag, the builders left extra marble in the middle. The ancient Greeks realized that to construct a building that appears perfect, they would have to come up with a design that tricks the eye. What they invent is a system of optical refinements.
Their concern was the visual perfection of the building.
So there you have it. This part 1 video has covered the design features of the building, and I hope that tells you something about the Parthenon, what it reveals about Greek beliefs and values. I'll do a second video, part 2, to talk about the artistic features, what's on the inside of the building and what are the decorative features on the outside of the Parthenon.